Hi, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Guatemala today. My purpose being three different things. One, to inform you about Guatemalan culture and background. Two, to inform you about an interview that I did with a local Guatemalan family living in the United States. And three, to kind of connect that together to talk to teachers about how they can work with Guatemalan students in their classrooms. The reality is, Guatemalans are constantly moving to the United States. And so if you don't have a student from Guatemala in your class now, there's a very good chance that you will over the next 5 or 10 years. We'll start with talking about some background about Guatemala. Guatemala is a country of rich history. It started off with Mayan people of indigenous background, Native Americans. But then that mixed with the influence of the Spaniards when the Spaniards came during the Age of Exploration. And this is kind of combined together to make Guatemala this interesting, vibrant country that it is. Guatemala's geography is bordered by Mexico to the north, Honduras to the east, and El Salvador to the south. This location in the heart of Central America has made it such a rich place with all these different cultures kind of combined. One of the main reasons that we have so many Guatemalans immigrating to the United States today is for a couple of reasons. One, there's been an economic struggle in that country, and there's a lot of people fighting poverty on a daily basis. Two, Guatemala has a history of political unrest ever since the Spaniards came, all the way up to their civil war that just completed in the 90s. They've even got some current things going on with corruption in their government and all of that. And then the third reason being they are on a major fault line, and they have a lot of natural disasters. They have earthquakes, they have volcanic eruptions, and they have the chance of hurricanes at times as well. So these different things have combined to cause lots of Guatemalans to move to the United States over the past century. In fact, it's estimated that there's about 1.2 million Guatemalan Americans living in America. Like I said, with this number, it's very likely that as teachers we're going to encounter Guatemalan students in our classroom, which makes Guatemala a very important topic for us to talk about. As far as the population of Guatemala, there's three different groups that make up the population. About half of the population are indigenous. Most of these indigenous people are Mayan. These Mayans speak tribal languages. There's about 20 different Mayan dialects, and most of them don't speak Spanish. There are a few in each group that do. The second group of Guatemalans are called Mestizoes. They are a mixture of Spanish people with the indigenous race. They would be the dark-skinned, Spanish-speaking Guatemalans that mostly would be the primary people living in the United States that we would encounter. And then the third group are called the Ladinos. This is a very small group of upper-class Caucasians living in Guatemala, pretty much direct descendants of the Spanish conquistadors and the other people that came over with the Spanish. As far as language, like I mentioned, Spanish is not the only language. It is one of about 20-something languages. There are about 20-something Mayan languages, but Spanish is the primary language. And Spanish obviously came over to Guatemala during the Spanish exploration era, and the language kind of mixed with the culture and transitioned into a unique Spanish language that is spoken in Guatemala. A few things about Spanish real quick. Spanish is written using the Latin alphabet system just like English. The letters are pretty much the same as English. There's a few variations, such as they put accents on their vowels sometimes for emphasis. There's a couple of characters such as the ñ and the double L that make some different sounds. In general, Spanish is a subject, verb, object language, just like English. The subject comes first, then the verb, then the object. There are some exceptions to this in Spanish, based on conjugation and the way they conjugate their verbs. The orthography of Spanish is very easy. So basically, once you learn the sounds of the letters, it's very easy to read in Spanish. Whether you know the meaning or not is a different story, but you can pronounce things very well. The one big difference in Guatemalan Spanish from the rest of the world is their dialect uses a voceo conjugation for the second person. And so they would conjugate things a little different than other Spanish speakers around the world would. that's an informal conjugation, so it should only be used with people that are familiar with each other and not with people that you should be showing respect to. Guatemala is a very important value to them. Primarily, Guatemalans are Roman Catholic. This is due to the fact that the Spanish brought it over during the Spanish conquest. But Catholicism in Guatemala is mixed with a lot of Mayan traditions. An example of this is some Mayan Catholic churches still sacrifice animals. Um, and so they've kind of intertwined the two. In addition to Catholicism, Protestantism grew very popular in the 1980s. This was during the Civil War, and the reason it grew so popular was because some of the prominent Catholic leaders were associated with the rebel forces that were causing a lot of problems. There's a lot of Guatemalan people that are still Protestant today, so you kind of have a lot of Christianity, but two different distinct types of Christianity. One other thing is that Guatemalans are very open to religion, and that carries over into the public schools. They welcome religious ceremonies in the public schools, which would be a major difference from the United States. Next to religion, Guatemalans also value family highly. Family is one of the central centerpieces of Guatemalan culture. Uh, for example, often extended families either live in the same house or on adjoining properties, and they're very loyal to each other. When it comes to large decisions for the family as a whole, the patriarch or head male of the family is usually consulted for approval. As far as marriage and forming families, girls often marry very young in Guatemala, around 15, 16, 17 years old, and they're expected to start having kids right away. The woman's role in society is to be a mother and a wife. So very few women actually work outside the home. Some women that do work tend to do so in their home. They will sell tortillas out of their homes or work as seamstresses so that they can be home with their families. The men are the leaders of the family and usually the sole providers. In many communities, work is actually limited, which causes men to have to leave and work as migrant farmers. So oftentimes they send money home to their families and they don't get to return home very often. Other men might get to come home on weekend visits or make it home late at night after a long drive and commute to work. The education system of Guatemala is obviously of great interest to us as teachers. Guatemala's education system has made a lot of changes over the past few decades, which have been for the better, but there's still a lot of ground that they need to make up. Most Guatemalan students do attend school for some period, but for some that's only 2 or 3 years. They begin in primary school, which spans the grades of kindergarten to 6th grade. And some students continue on to the basic school, which is 7th to 9th grade, kind of like a middle school. And then finally, other students even then may continue on to what's called diversification, which is like a high school. But in this high school, it's different than the United States. Students choose a field, such as agriculture, secretary, or teacher, and study that particular field. There are universities in Guatemala, but it's very, very uncommon for students to actually reach that level of education. Most students only attend primary school, and the main reason for that is that there has been such a major push for it in the past few decades. The percentage of students that finish primary school has risen from 39% in the 90s to 72.5% in 2006. Um, and another big gain in the Guatemalan education system is that recently the Guatemalan Ministry of Education has put forth a set of standards for each grade level. There's no way of enforcing these standards yet, but at least they're shooting for the goal of having all students across grade levels learning the same thing throughout their country. While the Guatemalan education system has made some great gains, there are still some gaps in the system. Some of these gaps are that a great deal of Mayans still do not receive any education because the schools are only taught in Spanish and they choose not to go due to lack of knowledge of the Spanish language. There's also a high number of females who fail to complete their primary schooling, and that's because of just the values of their culture. They don't view education as necessary for females who are going to stay home and have a family. And so those are some problems, obviously. Also, would be lack of access to education for people in rural villages. Some of these villages still don't have schools, though they're making progress on that. Some other problems would be overcrowding, a lack of resources, and a lack of space. The typical Guatemalan classroom, even in a village that's well off is just desks and a whiteboard or a chalkboard, and the students only tend to have a pen and a notebook. There are no textbooks, there is no technology, um, no air conditioning, none of the luxuries we have in our schools today. The economy of Guatemala is predominantly dominated by agriculture. Much of this agriculture is shipped to other countries, such as the United States. Some of the exports include bananas, coffee, vegetables, and sugar. If you go to the grocery store, you may notice your bananas have a Made in Guatemala sign on them. However, despite the agriculture in the country, Guatemala is still faced with a lot of poverty and unequal distribution of wealth. The top 20% of Guatemala's population accounts for 51% of the wealth, leaving the bottom 80% to divide the 49% of the wealth. And half of Guatemala's population lives below the poverty line, which is a major problem. Since gaining independence from Spain in 1821, Guatemala's political history has been very unstable. There have been various overthrows of government leaders, and there was a civil war between political parties that spanned from 1960 to 1996. The unstable government actually continues. Most recently, a few weeks ago, Guatemala's vice president, Roxana Baldetti, resigned because she was involved in the corrupt spending of tax dollars. As a general rule, though, Guatemala is now a democratic republic. They have three branches, just as the United States. And though they have had many constitutions, their latest was written in 1985. It was suspended for a period during the Civil War and amended and reinstated in 1993. For my interview, I got to interview the Santiago family. I had their daughter, Gabby, in class last year, so that's how we originally connected. In their interview, I went to their home, and we sat down in their living room, and I asked them some questions about their background. The family moved to Rhode Island and originally lived in Providence, Rhode Island, but they relocated to Kentucky because they reported a lot of gang violence there in Rhode Island. Children kind of atmosphere. When they talked about their life in Guatemala, they said that once they both got married, they lived with the husband's family on the same street with a house beside his parents and his brothers. And they said that it was nice living with family, but one of the hardest parts was that they did not have refrigerators. So every day they'd have to go buy their food at the market just for that day. So they said one day you might have to go to 4 different stores just to get food for the day, and you had to do that every single day. As far as educational background, both parents finished up their primary schooling in Guatemala, and the mother also finished middle school, which was the basic school, and a year of the 10th grade with a specialization in secretary. She said she never got the chance to finish that because of having kids, and that she also said that 2 of their children started the primary school there in Guatemala before coming to the United States. As far as their religion, the mother says that she was evangelical or Protestant while living in Guatemala and still is. And the father was Catholic at the time, but he later converted to Protestantism once he came to the United States and his daughter was born. We talked about their jobs in Guatemala. The father said that he worked in construction and architecture, and the mother worked for a private post office company that seemed to resemble FedEx or UPS. They both said they enjoyed their jobs but were seeking more opportunities. And the mom said that once she had children, she started to stay home, which would resemble the family background in Guatemala. They originally came to the States just for a better life for their children. They mentioned that they would probably never go back to Guatemala because their children would have problems with things like the mosquitoes and the heat and the difficulty of getting food. As far as implications for classroom teachers, one of the things that stood out the most to me was the struggle that it is for immigrant families to move to a new country and to learn a new language. One of the things that the family I interviewed reported having difficulties with was obviously the language, and that goes the same for our students. So there are a few things we can do to make this transition easier on students and their families. One is to build relationships, and a great way to do that is through home visits, just like the interview that I did. That's something you could set a goal for yourself to do once a month with students from different cultures to try to understand their cultures. And it's just a great way to connect with families. The second thing is on the language side of things, using the WIDA ICANN standards in your class and having language objectives in addition to content objectives. will really help students develop the academic or language proficiency that they need to succeed. And finally, I would just encourage teachers to be an advocate for these students. Don't forget where they're coming from and really try to support them and connect with their background understanding. And I think if you do these things, if you connect with their families and build relationships, if you use the WIDA ICANN standards and focus on academic language, and if you work with these students to connect with where they're coming from, that'll go a long way in your classroom. Thank you for your time.